As we begin 7-2, we're talking about that time period in American history following the American Revolution, and then we had just been discussing the Articles of Confederation and the strengths and weaknesses of it. So now we move forward. So as we go back, we want to look at some of the things we're going to be talking about, which are the two plans that are going to be presented at the Philadelphia Convention. And we're going to discuss the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan and the different parts of those. We'll also need to talk about the two compromises that were necessary for the Constitution to actually be accepted, because obviously there were competing views, there were competing viewpoints, and not everyone wanted each part to be fully adopted. So that is where we're at now. So as we go back and we think about Shays' Rebellion, Shays' Rebellion, of course, was that uprising in western Massachusetts by farmers who had been having their farms seized due to lack of payment, and there were people being thrown in jail, which we would call debtor's prison, and they couldn't pay that debt, and it was a never-ending cycle. And so western farmers in Massachusetts had had enough. And so what had happened there is Daniel Shays, a veteran of the American Revolution, thought it was unfair, even though he had not gotten all his pay from his service, and he called on his government to fix it. He called on the central government of the Confederation government, but they couldn't do anything because they didn't really have any power over the states. Most of the time the states held all the power. So what happens in Shays' Rebellion is that he organizes this group of farmers, and the number of farmers continue to grow until they are about between 1,000 and 2,000 strong, mostly, working farmers, and they basically decide that they are going to vent their anger in some type of demonstration. The demonstration that they decide to do is they realize that they are Western farmers and they have lots of problems with people in the East. So as we move on here, he decides to organize these farmers to go after courthouses, because courthouses were the places where evictions would take place, that people would be removed from their farms, and if they could shut down the courts, they could shut down the process. That was what had happened, and that's his plan on figuring out how to stop what he considered was unfair practices. So his followers, some of them were armed with pistols and rifles, but many of them were just armed with the normal implements of farming, pikes and pitchforks and things like that. So they felt if they were really going to get their way, they needed to move towards Boston. And to do that, they needed weapons and they needed to go to an arsenal. And so what they decide to do is to make this move on an arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts. And that really scares some of the leaders in Boston. And so since the governor doesn't really have a lot of power to organize the state troops, he actually goes to the regular businessmen of Boston and basically hires a mercenary army, what they refer to as a militia, to confront these angry farmers moving throughout western Massachusetts. And eventually it all comes to a head early in 1787, where basically the paid militia fire a warning shot over the assembled farmers that were there, and they still continue to move towards them, and so they fired into these advancing farmers. Some were killed, some were wounded, but most of them basically fled into the hills. And that pretty much ends the organized portion of Shays' Rebellion, which had stretched back several months into the fall of 1786. So to understand why we need to focus on Shays' Rebellion, we have to understand what do people do in reaction to it. And basically, most of the leaders throughout the country, both in the north, in the middle, and the southern states, are somewhat upset by what has happened up in Massachusetts. You had basically a roving mob of farmers who basically tried to gain control of a government and failed. So what it did is it really scares leaders into deciding we need to fix this thing known as the Articles of Confederation. And we've got to call a meeting, and so the meeting that they decide is Philadelphia, because Philadelphia is one of the most advanced cities of the time, and they decide that they're going to meet in the summer of 1787 to discuss amending the Articles of Confederation. That is their main plan, and so here is where they're going to meet. Independence Hall, also known, the same place that the Declaration of Independence was, and yes, hanging up here would be the Liberty Bell. This is where the leaders decide from the various states to meet in the summer of 1787. Now, some members from various states had their own ideas of how they could fix this confederation, but most of them considered fixing it almost impossible because, remember, amending the articles takes all 13. So an amazing thing happens on the second day of the convention. They basically vote to throw out the articles and attempt to come up with a new constitution. And as your book says, there were these groups of people that we would call nationalists that wanted a stronger federal government, a stronger organized central government than they had under the articles. And the first one to be presented is done by the Virginia delegation, so it's simply called the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan was the work of a different person, but the man who stood up and introduced it was a guy by the name of Edmund Randolph. He is the governor of the state, so he gets the distinction of standing up and introducing the plan. But the plan is really the work of a man who's been dedicated over the last few years to reading various essays on government, and that's James Madison. James Madison, at the time, he's in his mid-30s. He basically is the man to know about government theory and how government should be organized. And so, since the government that we have today is pretty much what he envisioned, we give him the nickname of the Father of the Constitution. So, that is where we are now with the Virginia Plan. So let's talk about the different portions of it. So as we discuss the portions of it, let's discuss the men who show up in Philadelphia. They're a wide-ranging group of people, from very young to the 26-year-old is the youngest delegate to the oldest, which is 81. The Venerable Benjamin Franklin, he is there, very respected. And so there's lawyers, there's some doctors, there are merchants, there are landed men, meaning they own a lot of property. And so they're the people that are arriving here in Philadelphia. James Madison, I'll show you a picture here. This is him, and he actually becomes president later in the early 1800s. So this is him much older, but I like the idea of what he thinks about government. He says the essence of government is power, and power lodged as it must be in the human hands will ever be liable to abuse. So if you're not really sure what liable means, you might want to look that one up. So let's talk about the Virginia Plan. His part calls for a two-house legislature. Two houses, lawmaking branch. Now, the original Confederation Congress did not have that. It had a one-house legislature. He also calls for something known as proportional representation in both houses. So let's bring this picture up. As we look at the United States Capitol building, what he originally envisioned is today we have the lawmaking branch known as Congress. Congress has the House of Representatives and it has the Senate. In his original take on it, he wanted proportional representation. What that means is the states that have bigger portions of population get more representation in both houses. Okay? Now remember, a two-house legislature is referred to as a bicameral legislature. Okay? If we had one house, it would be called a unicameral legislature, but we have a bicameral. And that was part of Madison's genius, is that he wanted to divide and make lawmaking a more arduous process, that you're not quickly making laws, but that it takes time and sometimes contention between different parties and different theories. Moving on with more portions of the Virginia Plan, in the original Virginia Plan, remember original, he wanted the chief executive picked by the legislature. So what that means is the chief executive is a big fancy word for the president. And in his original draft, he wanted the President of the United States to be picked by the Congress of the United States. So not a direct election of a president. He wanted basically people to elect their House of Representative members. The House of Representative members from each state would then pick their own two senators, and jointly that body would basically pick the President of the United States. So in the last election, that would mean that President Trump would have been selected by the United States Congress. So, is that the way that we choose the president today? Of course it's not. So I'm going to end it right here because this is where I stopped in class, and I want everyone to be at the same location as we begin continuation of discussions of the various plans of government.